Or everything works. Does it look like it's up for everyone? Can everyone see that?
It says you started screen sharing, and it might take a second or two
Okay,
to
everything's a
actually
little
see
bit
it.
slow. Let me know when it pops up because I can't see anything else, it seems.
It's on.
All right, very good. I'm going to start with a commercial real quick for those of you who are still looking for classes for the summer. They're still open in sections for my intro and critical thinking classes, especially summer 2, so check those out. And for the fall 203, History of Philosophy Contemporary. Link there you can check out to see more about sample syllabi and all of that. Okay, let's get right to the discussion then. This is the title of the talk, Mirror Neurons and Mirth Addiction. I have to admit the phrase mirth addiction is a bit, I use that a bit loosely, mainly because it makes for a really good title, which something your teachers don't want you to know. 90% of your papers is basically how good it is. So keep that in mind as you're writing your papers. They don't want you to know that. But I do mean it. There is an element to addiction to mirth, as we're going to see. This will be a little more difficult to present than I had anticipated because I'm not going to be able to see or hear you respond to anything that I take to be hilarious, and so I won't get that immediate feedback. In any case, please do interject if I cut out or if something's unclear, or if you have a question about clarification, please do jump in and interrupt me. Let me just say a little bit about myself and my interest in this. I teach philosophy here at Santa Barbara City College.
Chris, you're breaking up a little bit. We lost you for a couple of seconds there.
Okay.
So you may want to reiterate what you just said in the last couple of seconds.
I'm sorry. Okay. I've been teaching here at Santa Barbara City College since 2017. I've been interested in humor, laughter, in particular humorous laughter, since I was about 5 years old. That's when I made my first joke, and when my parents and my whole family started responding so positively to that, I enjoyed that. I still remember that kind of internal warmth feeling of them laughing with me as opposed to at me. And I, since then, have wanted to repeat that. And that was my first addiction at 5 years old. I would say it's an accurate assessment. And I wanted to know what makes things funny and why. And I didn't know at the time. That was a philosophical question. And by the way, the joke was probably not intentional. In fact, it certainly wasn't. But my parents wanted it to be, I think. We were eating breakfast and I had my fork hovering over the plate with scrambled eggs on the fork itself. I accidentally hit the fork on the side of the plate, turning it into a catapult, spreading the scrambled eggs everywhere. And I said, an explosion, but my family heard egg explosion, which is probably what they wanted to hear. In any case, they laughed hysterically and explained to me it's funny, and I've been interested in it ever since, even as much as trying to write a master's thesis on laughter and humor, but I didn't have a clue as to what it would be, and my thesis advisor suggested doing something in consciousness, because that's what he was interested in, and I was too, so it worked out. And it wasn't until my PhD work, I was able to do a dissertation on subversive humor, and I was lucky I had a chair who led that dissertation committee and was open to that view, open to that idea without worrying about employment. Philosophy of humor wasn't at the time a very important field in philosophy, and I think there's a lot of people trying to push it, and I'm one of those, and I'll say why that is today, in fact. In a nutshell, the talk is going to be about how laughter um, is addicting and it is contagious. And both of those facets are positives. Both of those are beneficial. It could spread like a pandemic, as we're going to see. But all of that is useful, I would argue. So I'm going to start with mirror neurons. This is something that those in the Neuroclub, I suspect, have heard of. I've mentioned these in my philosophy classes, in particular when we get into the philosophy of mind. I'm most interested in the way that the neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran puts it. He's down at UCSD. I think they call him a rock star of neuroscience. But this quotation from him, from the Neurology of Self-Awareness, it's a shorter term, neurons, and the Neurology of Self-Awareness is filled with philosophically interesting ideas. What are these neurons? They are found in the motor cortex area, generally of our brain, in the anterior cingulate. In particular, he says that will respond to a patient being poked with a needle. They are often referred to as sensory pain neurons, which is not itself surprising. But the remarkable element of these was that researchers in Toronto, and it actually was found in Italy initially with non-human patients, non-human creatures, monkeys in particular, they found that some of these neurons will fire equally strongly when a patient watches someone else being poked. And Ramachandran calls these empathy neurons or Dalai Lama neurons. And here's, I think it's just fascinating, they are dissolving the barrier between self and others. And he's not being metaphorical in this. He's saying the neuron in question does not know the difference between it and the body it belongs to and other people. You have a sense of introspecting on your own thoughts and feelings and of watching yourself going about your business as if, I like that phrase, as if you were looking at yourself from the other person's vantage point. There's way too much philosophically of interest here for me to go into in any depth, but the question of how these neurons fire and how they connect us to other people in an empathic way, I think is fascinating in general, but specifically, there's ways of connecting it, I think, to our discussion here. There's other elements of this, the idea that neurons can know the difference between things. I find that philosophically interesting too. It's an interesting question. Is it neurons that possess knowledge, or is it people that possess knowledge? And that has connections to consciousness studies as well. Are brains conscious? Are neurons conscious? Or is it the entire system that is conscious? Not specifically related to what we're talking about here. The study of these neurons was the discovery of them, as with so many scientific discoveries, and I noticed Dennis Gagnon was on the list here. Good to see you, Dennis. He will attest to this in his history of ideas in physics, and philosophy of physics. A lot of discoveries, a lot of eureka moments are accidental. You're studying one thing and you happen upon other things. And so these scientists in Italy were studying brains of monkeys. They had them in these fMRI machines, functional magnetic resonance imaging machines, and they recognized that neurons would fire in the motor cortex of a monkey that was watching another monkey reach for, in this case, a nut. It was goal-directed behavior. It was searching out for something for a purpose. And the neurons in the brain of the monkey watching this other monkey were firing as if that very monkey that was under the fMRI machine was doing that same activity. And this then later became known as, they called them mirror neurons. The connection that these empathy neurons might play with respect to social bonding is incredibly, the potential is incredible. In fact, Ramachandran at one point said something like the discovery of mirror neurons in neuroscience is akin to the discovery, I forgot what it was, DNA for biology. I think that was what it was, which is pretty impressive notion. But Giacomo Rizzolatti and Iacoboni, I think is Marco Iacoboni, was a couple of these researchers early on, recognizing the social element of this. Of course, Aristotle, 2,300 years earlier, also recognized that we are social beings. but he didn't have the neuroscience to back up just how much that is grounded in our brain cell chemistry and so forth. What is interesting here is that these mirror neurons allow us to understand other people's minds, not through conceptual reasoning, but through imitation, feeling, and I would add, not just thinking. This is huge in philosophy. The history of philosophy is one going back to Plato that looks at the parts of the brain, the parts of the self, the parts of the soul. There's the reasoning capacity, the reasoning, the logical, the cognitive. Of course, that's the most important for philosophy. And then there's the absolutely separate emotional, the feeling, and those should not intertwine. And whenever they do, there's disaster. That was the view since Plato and up until recent, I think, philosophy in the 20th century. Then we find that that is simply mistaken. There are problems if we have our emotions override our capacity to think. There's no doubt about that. We talk about that in the critical thinking logic classes with respect to fallacies. But to not have the emotive connection to the content of our discussion or thinking or interaction with others leads to sometimes absurd logical conclusions. To give just one example where feeling, emotion, and note the root of emotion is analogous to and similar to motivation, there's something called the Capgras delusion, in which patients will see their parents logically, intellectually reason that, yeah, they look like my parents, they sound like my parents, and so on, but they are not my parents. They are imposters. And they insist upon this conclusion. And that just sounds crazy. But again, with Ramachandran, he did studies on patients who had this delusion, and he looked into the brain anatomy, and he recognized that in some of these patients, there was a connection, damage to part of their brain, a pathway that went through the emotional centers, the amygdala. That pathway for this patient was damaged. The pathway that led to the conscious pathway that led to the, let's say, the cognitive, to put it generally, areas was perfectly untouched. And that worked. Logic, reason alone led to the absurd conclusion that his parents were imposters. This shows the necessity of the intermingling of emotion and reason. And I think it's only recently within philosophy that those two have been brought back together again. And I think studies in humor in particular can benefit that, because what's fascinating about humor and laughter generally, not only that is it the case that everyone does it, everyone, you are, whatever culture, this is something that is absolutely universal. You see this even with cultures that are separated almost completely from any other intervention, like the Himba in Namibia, for example. The Himba tribes, their conception, their presentation and understanding of laughter is exactly the same as everyone else's. So it's important, I think, to see that, to study that as far as you're interested in human nature. But with respect to the philosophy of this, the overlap between our emotion and our intellect, humor does this in a way that is, I think, more relevant to studies in this than anything else. There needs to be a cognitive element to get what people are saying, and there needs to be an emotional connection, the mirth part, the feeling. Back to mirror neurons. These neurons connect us, and there's a fine distinction between mimicry and mockery, but it is mimicry that enables us, it seems, learn very early on. And there's a lot of studies. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each of these. These slides, since they're recorded, you can look on them, and I'll post I can post the slides to Leda as well, so you'll have access to them. There's a lot of links about studies. In fact, Leda, I believe you're interested in language, neuroscience and language, if I'm not mistaken. So these studies
yes.
you may be interested in them. There's a neuroscientist who's studying, whose area was language, and her name escapes me now. And she started studying laughter because the connections between language use, language expression, the areas of the brain that deal with language creation and understanding Broca's and Wernicke's areas in particular. She studies that. That led her to study laughter and how that plays a role. Borrowing from a scientist named Robert Provine in his book, A Scientific Investigation into Laughter. But with mirror neurons, we see it immediately, and it's absolutely fascinating. This baby pictured here, that's the father. The baby doesn't even know it has a face yet, and it's mimicking the father's representations. This is, I think the phrase is oftentimes invisible imitation. And this mimicry, this imitation is essential to learning, but it's not only essential to learning, it's essential to empathic connections with other people. But you see it also with non-human animals. In fact, as you recall, the eureka moment of discovering these neurons and the amazing connections that they have between and among people was found in monkeys. And you see here Jane Goodall, you see it with primates, and you see it with tiny, tiny little monkeys here. I don't know if you can see it. His tiny little tongue is coming out, and in reaction to this dude's obviously strange looking tongue, it works across species, which is fascinating. And so what's happening? Why is this relevant to humans? Philosophically, I got interested in mirror neurons when I was reading the works of a guy named Edmund Husserl. He is a philosopher that he died in 1938. He wrote mostly during the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he's a phenomenologist. And he studies intersubjectivity, which is a fancy word that basically we can narrow it down to interconnecting with other people in an immediate, non-theoretical way. We recognize what other people are doing, what they're thinking. We have a theory of their minds, their internal mental states, not because we make inferential, logical, analogical arguments, which has been the case, and it may be different now, but in cognitive science, that was often the view. We make very quickly, but very logical, inductive inferences about other people. Husserl's view is that this empathy, and his student Edith Stein studied empathy to a great extent, it happens as a mode of coping with others in a way that is immediate, and in fact he uses a phrase called co-experiencing, and it's prior to any kind of linguistic or logical analysis. It is immediate, and you see it. There's a philosopher named Dieter Lohmar who uses this example from Jurassic Park. The mirror neurons here are activated when you're in the theater. This isn't the scene exactly that I wanted. I was looking for the scene where the dude's legs were just jutting out underneath the Jeep and the T-Rex is coming to bite them. And people in the theater will instinctively pull their legs in as if they were the ones in that Jeep trying to escape the T-Rex. Now, there are other parts of their brains that are interfering and telling them, no, this is not, you're not actually there. This is merely science fiction or whatever. But it's fascinating that we act as if we're being threatened. We put ourselves, remember Ramachandran's phrase, the neurons in question can't distinguish between self and other in these situations. And we see this lived out when we watch scary movies or movies like this, and we act as if we are frightened. If you ask the person, do you think that dinosaur is going to get you? Clearly, they're not going to consciously endorse that belief. And I think that fact is going to be relevant if we have time at the end to talk about why it is that we sometimes laugh at what we ourselves would consider morally objective, morally offensive jokes. It may be that we're in a mental state that the philosopher Tamar Gendler calls an a-leaf. We act as if we believed something were the case, but if we were asked about it consciously, we would state that we didn't. But that's for later if we have time. So the neurons in question are connecting us, and they connect us in particular when we see somebody else in goal-directed behavior, but also when we see others in pain. And that's why when we see somebody get harmed, the more close they are to us, by the way, the more we feel it. It is not, I'm recognizing that when I get hit in the crotch, I also react in that way. It's, I see it and I feel it. Now that's a cartoon character, so it's a little harder to experience that too, as Husserl puts it, co-experience it. But when you see this dude do that, and I looked for so long, this, believe it or not, it took me like 30 minutes to find just this, because I wanted to find a better one. And some of them were just terrible. Like, I don't want to show it because they're awful, and really make us cringe. But this one is supposed to get you to realize, to experience it with that person. You're not intellectually going through it. And the closer you are to that individual, like when my daughter jumps from, you know, a height that, you know, she's fine, she's young, she's malleable. If I were to have jumped from that, my knees would probably just shatter. And so when she jumps, I suffer. I see damage happening. I feel it, even though she ends up being fine. This one's just gratuitous. I'm assuming you're laughing at this, but again, I
can keep my mic on if you need a little bit of an audience, Chris.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. There's a reason why we have laugh tracks, as annoying as they are. There's a history to that. Back in the 50s, there was a show called the Hank McCune Show. Anyone out there remember that show? Sorry. Couldn't afford or stopped having a studio audience. I don't recall why. And some brilliant person thought, you know what about the audiences at home? How are they going to, this is how they phrased it, how are they going to know when to laugh if there's not a studio audience, which is an amazing thing to say. And they decided, well, let's record actual audiences and then play that at the right time. And that's tough to do. And that would then lead to instigating laughter. And it works. We know that when we hear other people laugh, and this is going to bring us to the next point that I want to make, it is contagious. It is as contagious as laughter. And if you look at these, just for a little bit, and there's a link to the studies on yawning and mirror neurons. Maybe you'd be surprised, maybe not. There are hundreds of studies on yawning. In fact, I found one paper from the Frontiers of Neurology and Neuroscience titled Yawn, 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 the social, evolutionary, and neuroscientific facets of contagious yawning. And a lot of that research looks at the social elements of it, but also the neuroscientific evidence that shows that in the areas of the brain, I believe in most cases it's referred to as the the inferior frontal gyrus, which is part of the mirror neuron system, that is activated when one is yawning. Interestingly, the same area, the inferior frontal gyrus, however, I've not seen a lot of studies on this, but it's the same area that activate when we see or hear, in particular when we see and hear, another person laughing. It activates that same area in our brain. There's Ricky Gervais, Mila Kunis, I believe, is the one on the right. The child on the left, I have no idea who that is, but sure to be a famous actor. And we even perhaps at least smile when we see people like this dude here laughing. And the more genuine the laughter is, the more contagious it is. You can tell. Some people are really good at this, some people, others not, but you can tell when it's fake laughter. And I'll get more.
That's a rare clip right there.
Which one, the Putin?
Yeah, I can't say I've seen many of those.
I know, it's rare. Surely something horrible has happened that he's had somebody off, and that's amusing. Nevertheless, if you don't know, you can still see his face, and there's an element of contagion to it. And now you want to know, I think for those out there interested in science, interested in biology, interested in evolution, look at these people. Look at her, look at Mila Kunis. She's laughing really hard. Ricky Gervais, he's probably pissed himself there. He's not able to do much. How is this evolutionarily beneficial? And I don't think it's adequate to say, well, we're still laughing now. It's 2020, it's even a pandemic and people are still laughing. So clearly it's evolutionarily beneficial. This, of course, won't do. We can imagine we're out on the savannah just I don't know, talking with each other in our coat and tie. And then we're laughing really hard at something. And what does that do? The laughter, the loudness of it triggers and gives away our location. That's supposed to have been scary. And it's attacking him. And when you laugh, you double over. If you laugh really hard, you are incapacitated. In some cases, you really do wet yourself. One of my children, I'm not going to mention which one, for flipper reasons, was laughing so hard, they wet themselves. And in the same instance, the other child was holding her cup, their cup, excuse me, and she dropped it. I said, "Why'd you do that?" I said, "I couldn't my hand," because she was laughing so hard. The point is, it's not obvious how it would be beneficial to laugh, to literally incapacitate the individual. So the benefit has to outweigh any of the potential negatives. And we'll see what that benefit might be. And here's a baby. Here's a baby laughing at a joke. Photons have mass. I didn't even know they were Catholic. Now the baby's saying that's funny. Obviously, infants don't laugh at humorous stuff. There's an interesting distinction we have to make. Laughter is neither necessary nor sufficient for humor. So humor and laughter are not the same thing. This is preliminary stuff that I've been talking about here, but I'm going to get into humorous laughter in particular, but they're not completely separate, of course. But this baby is laughing. The baby's probably laughing at her parent or his parent, who may have been laughing at this joke. And this joke here again is the emotional, the feeling of mirth you get, that joy, that aesthetic pleasure, is intrinsically valuable. It's valuable in and of itself, and it's a feeling, it's an emotion. But you don't get that ha-ha experience unless you can understand the physics of photons, at least a little bit, and the ambiguity of the term mass. Mass has multiple meanings. It has a meaning in physics, it has a meaning in theology. You have to know something about Catholics, and that Catholics go to mass to work. It's extremely complex, and yet it's embedded in a very, very tight, economical, almost poetic structure. And so there you find an overlap between the emotive centers and the cognitive centers, and it's fascinating. We do laugh a lot. We laugh way more than we think we do. This is something that Robert Provine, who I mentioned earlier, he was studying laughter back in 2000. And in his scientific discovery or investigation of laughter, he found that most people laugh not at humorous stuff, but at just meeting an old friend or talking in general. It's sort of a punctuation of a conversation. So most of the time we're laughing not at things that are humorous. And we don't even know why we laugh some of the times. That's fascinating. I have an anecdote of this. One of my kids and I was watching a television show, cartoon. My son, Milo, was about 4. The cartoon was Family Guy. So I'm a shitty parent, is what that means. And by the way, Lade, I hope it's okay. I want to occasionally use some salty language. I figure it's Friday and we're in a pandemic.
Go right ahead. We need it.
All right. Fuck yeah. So that was gratuitous. Sorry. I was watching Family Guy, and if you know about Family Guy, it's a cartoon, but it is not for children. And I was laughing very, very hard. I started tearing up. I was laughing so hard. And it was that episode where they had this beached whale. They were trying to move the whale off the beach with a forklift, and you can imagine how horrible it went. And it was not for children. And I was laughing so hard. Milo started laughing too, very hard. And then he said, "Why? I don't get it." After he was laughing very hard, "I don't get it. Why is it so funny?" And then I stopped and I looked at him and I said, "Why are you laughing?" And then he said, "I don't know." And then I said, "Huh." That's the story. But then I went back to watching the show, of course, because I'm a shitty parent. And then he kitchen knives or something, I'm sure. But we don't know why we laugh all the time, and we do it a lot. But I'm more interested in these kinds of causes of laughter. Oh, by the way, there's a link there if you want to know about that. Rats laugh. It's not just humans. There's a video link somewhere in the slides where I have primates laughing as well, monkeys, or excuse me, gorillas laughing, and it's hysterical. Rats laughing. There's a scientist named Jaak Panksepp, I think his name is, and he tickles rats. That's what he does. He found, again, a eureka moment. He was studying something else with rats, and he recognizes they were, at one point, if you rub their bellies, I guess, or their backs, they would start emitting a high-pitched squeal. And it turns out that's an enjoyable experience for them. They were laughing. That's what he calls it. Rats can get. Don't Google rat tickling, by the way. I'm pretty sure you're going to get what you did not expect. Okay, I'm talking about porn, by the way. You're going to get just straight porn. That's what's going to happen, so be cautious. These are the things I'm talking about that are most interesting to me, and here this phrase, non-threatening incongruities, that phrase I will make sense of in a bit. That is elemental, I think, to instances of humor. Okay, so why is it then? Why do we laugh? What are these awesome babies laughing at? Those are my children, of course. That's Lola, and that's Milo. What are they laughing at, and why are they? Why do we continue to laugh? And the argument I'm going to give is because we can't help it. We are addicted to that experience, that feeling of mirth. That's why I call it a mirth addiction, you see? Playing off of meth addiction. Yeah? Thank you. I suggest instead of comedy clubs across the nation, they should call them mirth labs. Okay, I'm assuming everyone else is laughing individually. Okay, so there is a lot of information on humor as a means, on laughter in particular, in general, excuse me, to help fight addiction and even pain. This goes back to the studies from Norm Cousins back in the 50s and 60s, or maybe even earlier than that, who suffered a disease that caused great suffering and pain. We know a lot about that. And there's even stand-up comedians who are public about how they use it to fight addiction. And there are others who use it to fight depression. All of that is amazing and fascinating. However, I don't know that there's a lot on studies of the addictive nature of laughter itself. And if you look at the amount of money that just Americans spend on comedy, the amount of hours you spend on looking at funny YouTube videos, I think there's an argument that could be made that we are indeed addicted to laughter. And there are some studies that try to, that demonstrate this. We see here, and there's a link to the study with respect to this, we can see the areas of the brain that light up. We have fairly strong evidence, correlative evidence, that shows these particular areas of the brain light up, these reward centers of the brain light up when you receive a drug fix, whether it's from heroin, cocaine, sugar, which insofar as the causes of death is in a way worse than heroin. I don't want to get into that because it pisses me off, the way that the marketers market to children with their sugary products. But the areas of the brain that light up when we get the drug fix of cocaine or heroin or whatever are the same areas. And there's a number of areas. One of them that's predominant is the mesolimbic area, I believe, that lights up when you get the fix of humor, of laughter. And there are people who have recognized this. One in particular, a guy named Matt Balachi, I'm not sure how you say his name. He was so interested in this. He has a PhD in, I forgot, brain science generally. I've forgotten what it was, but he's also a stand-up comedian. I think he also does stand-up comedy. Neuropsychologist, that's what he is. And he makes the point that natural highs, like laughter, like running, if you're a runner and you get a runner's high, that feels great. I once had that once, and it was amazing. I've never once gotten it back. I don't know how to do it. So I just, I resorted to cocaine when I run. It's a joke. So the phrase he gives, it's really nice. You'll never hear that that movie was so funny last night that I'm hungover, right? Instead, you say, oh, that party was so awesome last night. I feel like shit today. That's a problem. And you need more of it. The more alcohol you drink, you need to get that reward. The more heroin you use, the more you need to get that reward. And of course, the side effects of heroin, the side effects of alcohol, the side effects of tobacco, of sugar, of sex. I would include Fortnite. If my son were here, I'd say Fortnite is as bad as heroin. Humor works on the same reward centers, and there's debates about this, of course, but the side effects of, are far less problematic. So humor is better than heroin. If you take anything from this discussion, take with you the slogan, humor is better than heroin. There are obvious counterexamples. If a man is shot with an arrow in his stomach, does it hurt? Only when I laugh. So I know this is going to come up at one point. Is laughter the best medicine? I'll just answer that now. No, or it depends. That's the philosophical answer. It depends. If you've got a stomach problem, then no, laughter is not medicine. What are some of the side effects? I can't go through all of these, so I'm going to focus on a few. We've kind of looked a little bit at the empathic bonding, the connection that mirror neurons provide for us, and the connection that laughter can provide for us. But also, we know, releases endorphins. It reduces physical and emotional pain. People can utilize humor and laughter as a means to mitigate, not get rid of cancer. Laughter is not, this is not the secret. I'm not saying you can just laugh your cancer away, but it does help with reduction of pain, and not just in the manner of it being a placebo effect. But what I'm mostly interested in is the connection with this empathic connection between people and the use of humorous laughter, the fostering of humorous laughter in raising consciousness, exposing our fallacies. I try to make this as close to a drug and the possible side effects as you can get. A fallacy in logic is an error in reasoning. I'll talk about those in a moment. Bearing erroneous presuppositions, an error, a mistake. A presupposition is something that you assume to be the case, but you have not argued for. It's just taken for granted. And by the way, if you think about most of the beliefs in your head, most of the beliefs in your web of beliefs, I suspect you probably don't remember where they came from or what justification there was for them being in your head to begin with. One of the connections between a humorous attitude, and we'll show this at the end, and a philosophical attitude is that we can more readily question, be open to questioning our unconsidered presuppositions. These are beliefs that we have, that we act on, that affect us and affect others in ways that may be negative. And we may be morally responsible for these actions if they're based upon beliefs that we ourselves have not even considered as to why they may be true. And connected to this is this onset of a playful and open disposition. A humorous attitude is one that is inclined toward openness in a variety of ways. I would refer to it as epistemic openness. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. To be epistemically open is to be available to hearing counter evidence to your own perspective, being open to recognizing and being okay with your expectations not being met. You also can develop your stomach muscles because you use a lot. Laughter comes from the stomach, and well-defined cheek muscles. You look a lot. Now, this moves to the next point. Laughter is incredibly contagious. It can be very easily contracted by those near you. So in a way, you might think maybe a pandemic of laughter is a good thing. And for the most part, yes, except there really was a laugh epidemic. And there's debates now on exactly what was the cause of it and what was the extent of it, but you can find evidence of this. You can look this up if you have the time. In Tanzania, as it was called at the time, young girls started laughing in school, and this laughter became, I don't recall if they used the word hysterical to negative history to it. But they couldn't stop laughing. And it spread. It spread like a virus for a long time. And they ended up having to ultimately shut down the city, at least the village where this had occurred. And it was, in a sense, laughing against their will. And that was a problem, okay? If your laughter lasts longer than 4 hours, you should probably seek a doctor. Is that your dog, Leda?
No, it's the neighbors.
Oh, that's
There's
totally fine.
there's a
Totally
lot
fine.
of dogs where I'm at, especially at
Really?
night. They come out in packs.
Oh, that's right. What time is it there?
It's 5:17 p.m.
Ah, well, that's happy hour. This is a good time.
Yeah, it's starting to be that time. I can mute my mic if it's
No, no,
distracting.
no, no. That's totally fine. I don't mind it. Okay, so what was I saying? I made a erectile joke there. Laughing against your will. This happens, and I think there's a lot of interesting things to say about this. There's a distinction between conscious laughter, intentional laughter, where you fake it, and then there's real laughter, and you can tell the difference. There's a guy who studies facial expressions, physiognomy. His name escapes me now. I think it's Paul something, Paul Ekman maybe. And he's incredibly adept at determining genuine smiles from fake smiles. A fake smile is one where you are pretending. And the reason you can tell, if you understand the facial structure and the muscles involved between fake and real, is because there are muscles around your eyes that are activated, that are triggered, that are utilized non-consciously, and they cannot be consciously controlled. Why that is, I don't quite know the neurophysiology of that. They're called orbital, I forgot what they're called. Maybe, what the hell are they called? Orbicularis something or other. Orbicularis oculi, having to do with the eye socket. These activate when you are engaged in what philosophers of humor call Duchenne laughter, named after the scientist, I think it's Marcel Duchenne, who discovered the distinction between legitimate laughter and fake laughter. Legitimate laughter instigates, activates the muscles around the eyes that you cannot fake. And this has been known about its contagion, about its addiction. Charles Dickens, not obviously humorous looking fellow, but he's aware that there's nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. And we find in Robert Provine also this discussion of, he doesn't use mirror neurons, which I think is fascinating. This is in 2000, so the studies of mirror neurons were out there. But he talks about it as a laugh detector. And when we hear somebody laughing, it is a kind of trigger for us. And we respond to it, even if it's a mechanical laughter, but that doesn't work nearly as well. And that's fascinating too. But it counts, we have a kind of laugh generator, a neural circuit that produces the movement we hear as laughter. That to me sounds exactly like what happens when we see somebody yawn, activating the mesolimbic area, the mirror neuron area when we see or hear other people laughing. And sometimes you can't help it. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but you could watch this video many, many times over. Hopefully you can hear it okay. Let's see. We'll play. It may not work because there's too much going on. It's not going to work. That's frustrating. I can't get to it. Get out of there. Okay, well, that's too bad. It's really good. It's a really good video of babies laughing. That's what it is. So if we have time, I'll come back to that and see if it plays. But it's babies laughing, and they're laughing because their parents are laughing, and then you start laughing. And it's very difficult to not start, to not laugh. It's almost, even if you didn't want to, it's almost as if it's against your will, which I think Jim Holt puts it very well, borrowing from the Marquis de Sade. Any of you philosophers out there or literary fans, Marquis de Sade is interesting, to say the least. It's a 17th century porn, but it was high art. He says, the objective of sexual congress, according to the Marquis de Sade, is to elicit involuntary noise-making from your partner, which is precisely the objective of humor, even if the nature of the noise-making is a bit different. And this is something we've already talked about. We want to cause people to laugh. And there's all the positives that we've looked at so far and many others. We see this with laugh clubs and laughter yoga that has started back in the 90s. Kadaria, I think is his name, Dr. Madan Kadaria. His name escapes me now. All my notes are all over the place. I can't remember his name. I'll look that up for you later if you need. But we can, in a sense, induce ourselves to feel good. William James famously put it this way, we don't laugh because we're happy. We're happy because we laugh. And I borrowed from that. He has a paper called The Will to Believe, and I'm kind of expanding on that with the will to be happy. And I think it was William James, psychologist and philosopher, who suggested, again, back to those non-conscious muscles around our eyes, when you can activate those by biting on a pencil, as it turns out, you can trick your brain into thinking that you are in a good mood. And I tried this with my daughter Lola. Look at her, terribly sad. And I said, hey Lola, why don't you just bite on that pencil? What? Why? And look what happened. All of a sudden, magically, she's happy. The orbicularis oculi were activated. This is obviously a bit contrived here, but and I would not tell somebody with clinical depression just go bite on a pencil or just go laugh it away. Please make that known. But there is something fascinating about this that we can create, we can cause in others and ourselves, perhaps, a mirthful, which is a positive thing, feeling. So we've got mirror neurons, those connect us to other people. We've got laughter that seems to be instigated when we see others via the mirror neuron system. And we have, in a sense, an addiction to this feeling of mirth. And this feeling of mirth that is an addiction is also contagious, highly contagious. And if we have time at the end, I'll return to John Cleese. He's a very famous comedian. I think he has a webpage out now, Laughing Through the Pandemic. You can look that up and find there's still laughter going on. A wonderful thing about true laughter, I guess that's the Duchenne sort, is that it destroys any kind of system of dividing people. I think that's true, but it could also have exceptions. And if we have time at the end, we can talk about how laughter can be, in fact, divisive, depending on the kind of laughter it is. All right, so why is it a good thing? How can an addiction be a good thing? How can an addiction that is highly contagious be a good thing? Well, it reduces pain. It helps with oppression, but also depression. I'm wanting to say depression. I'll talk about oppression later. Empathy, intersubjectivity, it connects us. Robert Provine talks about the role of humor in connecting two individuals, not just groups. And what I'm most interested in now, the connections and the evolutionarily beneficial aspect of playfulness. When dogs, for instance, play fight, if they're your dogs, you can probably tell that they're playing. And more importantly, the two dogs that are play fighting, they can tell that it's just play. But notice it's really hard sometimes. It looks like from the outside, this is violent, this is aggression. And it is, but it's also non-threatening. It is a kind of training activity. Play is good, it's intrinsically valuable. In philosophy, we talk about the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value. If something has intrinsic value, it is valuable in and of itself. So you ask, your kids, hey Milo, why do you like to play? He just, I don't know, I just do. And that's it. That's all you need to say. It's valuable in and of itself. Therefore, it's intrinsically valuable. But it's also instrumentally valuable for a number of reasons. And I think there's a good argument to be made. I'm not going to make it here. No, there's not time for that. But humor, which I would call an adult form of play, not in that way, evolved from the kind of playfulness that we have and the kind of playfulness that we see in non-human animals. It is a non-threatening training ground. And when you're engaged in humor, you are also training yourself, preparing yourself for the real world. Excuse me. The real world, but you're dealing it in terms of humor, you're dealing it in terms of like thought experiment, it in terms of a non-threatening situation. But in this kind of playfulness, you are also engaging in a form of training. You are training yourself with this recognition of mistake and the enjoyment you get from recognizing that a mistake has been made. You are training yourself to be on the lookout for confusion, vagueness, ambiguity, mistake, unmet expectations. And if you're open to those unmet expectations, if you're open to ambiguity, if you're open to uncertainty, that means you are more likely open to detecting errors and not so dogmatic that you will deny that there was a mistake ever made. And it's not coincidental, I would say, that those who are most dogmatic are also those least prone to a sense of humor. And this goes back to any tyrant you want to in the history of the world. And you can look at contemporary examples. Saddam Hussein hated jokes at his expense. Actually, go before him, Hitler. Hitler despised jokes at his expense. He even had joke courts where they would imprison people who made fun of Hitler. Under the Soviet reign in Russia, there were groups who would attack this is a kind of asymmetrical warfare. They would attack the powerful Soviet government with humor because they didn't have the weapons. But those with power know the threats of humor. They know the power of it. And we see this with Erdogan in Egypt. In Turkey. He has imprisoned people. He tried to imprison a German comedian. I know German comedian, that sounds, sorry, I was gonna say oxymoronic, but I apologize. That's not to all my German friends out there. Germans have a great sense of humor. But he tried to punish a comedian in Germany who was making fun of Erdogan. The more dogmatic you are, the more comfortable you are in your felt sense of certainty, the less likely you are to recognize mistakes. And psychologically, you may be aware of this as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is connected to this as well. Those who lack information in a particular field of knowledge, however, have a disproportionate level of confidence in their claims about that area. For instance, someone might pronounce with a great deal of dogmatism and felt certainty and confidence that, I don't know, Windex can cure coronavirus, just as an example. I'll throw that out there. The confidence that this individual has is wholly disproportionate to that of their expertise. The less you know about something, it seems the more confidence you have, according to the Dunning-Kruger effect, in your beliefs about that thing. Whereas experts in a particular field are, interestingly, a lot more circumspect, a lot more aware of their own ignorance. And that, going back to Socrates, is an essential element of a philosophical attitude, recognizing the gap between what I know and what I believe I know, recognizing when I might be mistaken. In fact, for Socrates, wisdom is knowing where you are mistaken, where your ignorance is. Because if you're unaware of that, if you feel certain about something, there's no reason to investigate it. There's no reason to think about it because you are certain. Why waste any time on that? Humorous attitude opens us up to this. All right, and then there's also humorous attitude is a great response to and boon and buffer to those of us who recognize that the sun is eventually going to explode. So what's the point of it all? But I'm not going to talk about that today. That's too much. What do I mean by detection? I'm going to wrap up here. I don't know, maybe hopefully about 10 minutes. So there's plenty of time for discussion. The argument that comes from the philosophy of mind and the intersection of philosophy of mind and cognitive neuroscience, also artificial intelligence, is from a wonderful book by Matthew Hurley, Daniel Dennett, and Reginald Adams. Daniel Dennett is a very famous philosopher of mind in particular, and this I think arose out of his work that he did in 1991 on consciousness, wherein he explained consciousness. That was the name of the book, Consciousness Explained. That was 1991. You won't be surprised.
Slightly pretentious.
It's horribly pretentious, and he's still advocating for the same views. It's a great book, and it's very informative, insightful, but it's people hate Daniel Dennett or they love him. I've never heard anyone say, "Oh, Daniel Dennett, he's okay." I don't know, he upsets people for some reason. In any case, this book, he's investigating, trying to reverse engineer the human mind and realizing the role that humor plays in it. And he realizes the role that the reward centers in our brains play in this. Why is it that humor even comes about at all? In order for us to survive at all, we need to be able to think very, very quickly. We need to rely on what they refer to as heuristics. Heuristics in psychology, you see this in Daniel Kahneman in particular, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Heuristics are mental shortcuts, and they're almost always unconscious, and they work often. And so they're pragmatic, they're practically useful, but they go wrong. And sometimes they go wrong without our awareness. And if they continue to go wrong without our awareness, this could be damaging, detrimental to our survival. In fact, here's the way that they put it. Our brains are engaged in a full-time, real-time, risky heuristic search. A heuristic, again, is as a mental shortcut, a rule of thumb, almost always unconscious, where we generate presumptions or presuppositions about what will be next in every domain. This time-pressured, unsupervised generation process has necessarily lenient standards and introduces content, not all of which can be properly checked for truth, into our mental spaces. That is, the beliefs that pop into our heads, a lot of that happens that without our conscious examination. In fact, it could be argued that most of it does. They go on. If left unexamined, the inevitable errors of these vestibules of consciousness would ultimately continue on to contaminate our world knowledge store. Our world knowledge store. So there has to be a policy of double checking these candidate beliefs and surmisings, and the discovery of a resolution of these breakneck speed is maintained. Here's the key: by a powerful reward system, the feeling of humor, mirth, that must support this activity in competition with all the other things that you could be thinking about. End quote. We have a reward for propagating our species and continuing to do that. It's called the orgasm. And people get addicted to this. That's why we have porn. Well, there's a number of reasons for that. We get addicted to sugar. Sugar was not available for most of our evolutionary history. And it's necessary. We need glucose. And so it's not surprising we would hoard it when we can get it. Today, we have too much of it. And the people who make foods, by the way, they know this and they exploit it. They exploit our addiction to sugar. The difference is, as I've already said, the addiction to humor is a positive thing. Now, a little bit more on heuristics. What is a heuristic and why does it have anything to do with humor? The philosopher of aesthetics, Noel Carroll, gives a great example of this. He says a man orders a whole pizza pie for himself and is asked whether he wants it cut in 4 slices. He says 4 because I'm on a diet. That's mildly amusing because it is a violation. It is a mistake. We recognize an error here. And we are, yes, the dog agrees. We are rewarded with feelings of mirth. There's an enjoyment that gets us to want to replicate this. Now I'm on the lookout for this kind of ambiguity, this kind of confusion. Here are some of the heuristics involved. Typically, it's a general rule of thumb that when you're on a diet, you want to take in fewer calories. That usually works. Another heuristic at work here is when you are taking in fewer calories, you want to take in fewer or less amount of food. Fewer slices typically, heuristically, means you're going to be taking in fewer calories. There is an exception here, and we are rewarded through feelings of mirth in recognizing that this person has made a mistake. There is an exception to the rule. And in fact, in logic, there's a fallacy called the fallacy of accident. That is what this joke commits. And in humor, you are rewarded for making mistakes. In logic, you are not, just to clarify that for those who are going into logic next semester. Arthur Schopenhauer was aware of this. Arthur Schopenhauer, if you want to know more about him, take the Philosophy 203 Contemporary, where we look at his philosophy and how it influences Friedrich Nietzsche. Schopenhauer was an extreme pessimist, and yet he took time to write about humor. Amusement humor reveals that it's delightful to recognize when our reason, when our intellect has gone wrong, has made a mistake. Our presumptions that the world is perfectly reasonable is in fact undermined, and we're rewarded. We are rewarded for that experience. He even has a joke which he presents terribly. It was something like the prisoners, the prisoners and their guards were playing cards, and the guards recognized that the prisoner cheated, and so the guard kicked him out of the prison, something like that. Now, that's absurd. See the heuristics, he doesn't use the word heuristic. You can see the mistake that is made there. And we're rewarded a little bit with this feeling of mirth. This mirth addiction spreads. It's potentially beneficial. It gives, as Sami Bazou puts it, reason room to play. And again, this is an adult form of play. Play does not mean frivolous. Play is ambiguous itself. It could be serious in the sense that professional athletes are serious when they play. Professional musicians play music. They're serious when they do it. And comedians, of course, are very serious about their comedy and how they write their jokes. This humorous attitude not only helps us in being, for all the other reasons we talked about before biologically, but it fosters a kind of epistemic openness. And this openness pushes curiosity. And curiosity, which is necessary for learning, interest, right? That's that emotive, motivating aspect. You're not going to learn much if you're uninterested in it. You might be cognitive, rational, logical, but if you have no motivation to think about it, it's unlikely that you're going to spend any time with it at all. And so a humorous attitude, again, it's spreadable, is like a philosophical attitude, which is less spreadable. The humorous attitude places you, cultivates a kind of distance that's appropriate. You're not too close, such that you're overly emotional and can't think about it, but you're not so distant from the content of study that you don't even care about it, right? And so this openness pushes curiosity, that pushes the possibility for shifting perspectives, which is necessary for humor and getting jokes. You can't get the, aha, I get it, unless you've understood and can shift and alternate different viewpoints, oscillate from one viewpoint to another. And that leads to the possibility of you questioning presuppositions, which can lead to creativity and to new discoveries. I like how Isaac Asimov puts it, that's funny, as opposed to eureka when you discover something. You say, well, that's funny is ambiguous here. It's strange, it's unexpected. And that connection is important for our discussion. And here again, I'll wrap this up. Philosophers and humorists both play around these ambiguous edges. Most of life is uncertain. It feels good to have people in charge who appear to be certain, but there can be extreme negative consequences for somebody who feels certain, but in fact doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. And I think this is the majority of human life and interaction. Human beings are incredibly complex, the most complex entities in the universe as far as we know. And we need some kind of preparation for existing in a world that is not clear cut, that is not black and white, that is not good and evil, that is not obvious in any clear way. So to wrap up, I can hear people are upset with the length of this discussion in the background. I'll put into standard logical form for those philosophers out there. So mirror neurons connect us empathically, lots of evidence for that. Laughter very likely engages the mirror neuron system. There's not as much evidence for that yet. I don't know why. Maybe I just haven't found it. Laughter is highly contagious. And I think there's reasons for that, as we've seen. Laughter affects our reward centers, ultimately creating a mirth addiction. And I think all the side effects that I've covered so far are positive. I'd be interested in hearing some negative ones. And humorous laughter can be exploited for its highly addictive, contagious, and openness-inducing states. This is a form of adult play that is akin to a philosophical attitude that is both instrumentally and intrinsically valuable. I will end there, and I can return to any, if we want to get to this, if we have time, we can, but I'll return to any slide previous questions you might have. Should I now stop sharing? How should I do this? Or do you want me to keep the slides up later to take questions?
It's totally up to you.
Why don't I stop sharing so I can see people? Can you all see me? If you have a question, show yourself.
Let me actually go ahead and unmute everybody, I think.
Everybody?
Is that a bad idea?
Maybe only the one who's going to have a question first. I don't know how that works.
Nobody has raised, oh, there's a hand raised finally. All right, let's do this by person. Turn on your video only if you are speaking.
Okay, the problem now is that everyone just turned on.
Mute. Okay, everybody's muted. Gabriel wants to ask a question, so I'm going to mute him, and I think you have the ability to turn on your camera. So Gabriel is unmuted, and I think you can turn on your own camera, Gabriel.
Okay, it's on. Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. My question was, I found it interesting when you had mentioned certain regimes that ban laughter and see it as a threat. Can you elaborate a little more on that? Because you know what, it's just interesting to me because you do see like they're just so serious all the time, and like what are they scared of in that? I mean, like, can you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, great question. They're scared of, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
They're scared of looking foolish. They're scared of people recognizing, it's the old emperor's not wearing any clothes type of thing. They're scared of being revealed for the absurd positions and unjust viewpoints they have. It is fascinating. It doesn't always work. I mean, I would not advocate for use of humor in a violent situation. Although there's an anecdote about Abraham Lincoln. He was confronted with who wanted to have a duel with you, get your pistol or whatever, and somebody's honor was threatened or whatever, and Lincoln said, all right, I'll do this duel only if I get to choose the weapon, which is a common thing apparently. I get to choose the weapon and the distance and whatever. And the guy said, yeah, fine. And he said, all right, I choose cow shit at 5 paces. And the other guy who threatened to kill him laughed, and that was the end of it. So humor, according to the story, in that case, saved Lincoln's life. Now that could be bullshit, if I may. I like that story. There's a lot of other cases. There was a case of back in the 1950s where there was a country club that denied access, and no Jewish people were not allowed access to this country club. There was a famous comedian who wanted to play there, but he was half Jewish. And he asked the owner or whatever, he said, can I play 9 holes? Because I'm only half Jewish. And because you're supposed to play, a round of golf apparently is 18 holes. Is that right? I haven't played. Yeah. And that joke, it kind of brings down barriers and allows people to see, and you can find connections to people, even if you're politically completely disparate. Using humor to find connections is always a good starting point.
Yeah.
Likely to get people to discuss things with you. But there's a lot of data. So my dissertation's on subversive humor, the role of humor against oppression. You can see it used by Frederick Douglass against slavery, which is overt oppression. You see it within the concentration camps during the Holocaust. Man for Meaning, book by Viktor Frankl discusses the role of humor. And how this humor is seen to attack from below, subversive, it's attacking those positions of power, it spreads like wildfire, and it points out the absurdities in the oppressors in a way.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
If anybody else has a question, go ahead and raise your hand. You can do
Diana
it.
does.
Diana? All right, great. Go ahead. Oh, sorry,
Oh,
that was Luke.
Yeah,
Don't see
Diana.
Diana. Can you unmute her? Do you want to?
Oh, I can, yeah.
Yeah.
Did that work, Diana?
Yeah, I think we're good. Yeah, we're good. I see the green too. I unfortunately, be perfectly honest, I forgot and came in late, but it looks really good. I'm just wondering, will you be posting, say, a PowerPoint slide, a PowerPoint presentation? Or are you video recording this and we'll post it again later?
Lada's recording it, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so how do we get a hold of that recording?
We will send it out to the whole campus like we did the invitation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else?
I think Luke had his hand raised and Kiva.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so I can unmute?
I think so. But I can do it if you want.
Oh, yeah, you do it. I can't.
All right. Luke, you're
There
on.
it is.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Good. So I'm still wondering about the evolutionary benefit of laughter. I think you made a really good case for the benefit of humor as this area.
Oh, you clicked out, I'm afraid.
Oops. What's going on?
I didn't hear that. He's muted again.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me again?
Yeah, there you are. Yep.
Okay. So I'm still wondering what the evolutionary benefit of laughter is. I thought you made a really good case for the benefit of humor as this reward system for error detection for our heuristics. But I still don't see, like, I guess laughter, you know, it has this mimicry and this empathic connection. But I'd never thought about how, you know, it really just puts us at risk to predators, and it spends energy. And so I was curious if you could say some more about that.
Yeah. The energy it expends is analogous to working out, which we do know is beneficial. It really does. It releases all sorts of endorphins and serotonin, and the neuroscientific research into this is extensive. Later may be able to speak better to the specific brain regions that it affects. It is addictive, and that sounds negative, but the positives come from it. It is a pain reducer. It does alleviate stress. And I think all of those are perhaps secondary to connections it provides for human beings, for connecting people. The evolutionarily detrimental facets are overridden. The evolutionary detrimental effects of sex, there's a lot of detrimental effects of sex, but they're overridden by the positives. There are detrimental effects of sugar, too much of it, just as there's detrimental effects of too much sex. I believe the Duggars family is an example of that. So if you know the Duggars, if you don't, you can look them up. They've got too many.
You have to be a certain age to understand that.
Oh, is that right? That's a tough question, and I think we have to be cautious in reducing any current manifestation or benefit to a purely evolutionary one. I think we can exact, I think it's the term that's used. You know, reason itself is not something that probably evolved in the way that Socrates teaches, that it's in the means of tracking the truth. Reason probably evolved in a way similar to humor or to laughter for social cohesion. I want to be able to convince the people around me that I'm right, so they'll stick with me against my enemies. And here's a potential negative to laughter. because it may be connecting people, but when you bring groups together through laughter, which it does, you could also be dividing. And there are some trade-offs for sure. But the evolutionary question is a fascinating one, and I think it arrives out of playfulness. And the benefits of play are pretty clear. And when you're play fighting, there's oftentimes giggling going on. And what is tickling? Kids love being tickled. Where are you most ticklish? When do you laugh the most when you're tickled? In your most vulnerable places, right? And so why is that? Well, you're protecting yourself. I tickle Lola's daughter, and she protects herself. It's a kind of training, and there's some benefit as well. And you have to know the person that you're tickling. Let me clarify that. Tickling work if you don't know the person. Don't do that.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from anyone? Madeline, did we decide I can unmute? Yes, I can. Go ahead,
Thanks,
Madeline.
Luke. Let's go to Kiva. We only have about 7
Okay, I already
minutes. There's Kiva and Joe next.
Oh, you got
line.
the order. Okay.
I think
All right.
I'm breaking up for you guys, but hopefully you can hear me well
I
enough.
saw Madeline had a
Kiva,
question.
you're on. You
I
can
had
turn
the
on
same
your
question
camera if
as
you'd
Luke.
like.
Never mind.
Oh, okay. So Luke's up. Go ahead, Luke. Oh, shoot. I don't.
Kiva's unmuted. I don't know.
Oh, Kiva.
I was saying that I had the same question as Luke, so never
Okay.
mind. Thank you.
All right. So we'll lower your hand, and Joe is next. Joe, you're unmuted.
Hi, so this is actually Joe's wife. We sort of took
Hi,
over
Joe's
his
wife.
Zoom session because we found this to be so fascinating. So the question is pertaining to the negative effects. You know, there are social constructs as to when laughter is appropriate. And so when you think about situations, Joe mentioned being at a funeral and his dad made him laugh, and then him and his brothers couldn't stop laughing, and it was this horrible experience because he couldn't stop laughing in this very socially not acceptable place to be laughing. So just as a consideration, you know, that could be really detrimental. You know, if you have somebody who responds in a way that's socially unacceptable, i.e. laughter, that can really hurt their reputation, how they're perceived by others. So I don't know. I mean, that's something to consider. Maybe it's not so much a question as like a thought bubble to float your way. Is that something that you've done any exploring on, you know, in your work in this field?
Not specifically. That's a sociological question, and I know sociologists study sort of hierarchies within cultures and when is laughter acceptable, when isn't it, when is it not. It's a question of sociality. We want to know when people are laughing and why they're laughing, and so it means a lot. It's an essential communicative element. And you're right, there's situations, I was laughing at a mass, speaking of masses, long ago, and I couldn't stop laughing with my friend because the priest looked like the guy from Lucky Charms. And he sounded just like the guy from Lucky Charms, and we couldn't stop laughing. And that's the wrong time to laugh. But it depends. In a situation in which you're not expecting people to find anything humorous or to laugh, like a funeral.
So I suppose that would sort of fall back on what you're talking about with the mirror neurons. Like, why would you be laughing if socially we're trained that this is not appropriate, and yet that fire gets sparked, and then it's like, you know, the contagion thing and everything that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it depends. We laugh at all sorts of things, and it could be a different mechanism of laughter that is not based on humor. It could be an uncomfortable laughter. We laugh at things that we're, you know, when we're embarrassed. Sometimes laughter is a response, a kind of defense mechanism, and then it could spread like wildfire, and it could be negative.
Right.
However, there's a wonderful site called, or a company, I don't know if they're still around, called Life is Crap. And they talk about horrors of life, and that the only thing you can do about it is laugh at it. And there, this nihilism. Nihilism is the idea that there's no ultimate meaning. We're all finite mortal beings. We're all going to die. How do we confront that? How else can you, but with humor? Because humor puts you at the appropriate distance. You can think about it without being overburdened by it and wallowing in a puddle of urine or whatever the consequence might be.
So even in this negative consequence of laughing when it's inappropriate, there is a positive in that there's some buffer there. There's some positive mechanism.
I hope at my funeral people are making jokes. In fact, Monty Python, I referenced John Cleese earlier. When one of the Monty Python characters, players died, and I forgot which one it was, they had his ashes, and there's all of the Monty Python folks up on the table, and they're talking in front of a huge crowd, and they brought out his ashes. And the guy who brought it out tripped and fell, and the ashes went everywhere.
Right.
And everyone, this is Monty Python, so they knew it was intended as humor. It was hilarious. But you can't do that unless people have some expectation that, oh yeah, these are funny people. This is what they would expect in a way, even though the ashes is unexpected.
Right.
Thank you, Joe's wife. We have a few minutes. I think we have two more people. Somebody under the screen name of Terry Conway. Let's unmute this person. You can go ahead and turn on your camera if you'd like.
Okay. I have a comment on the late night talk show hosts who pretty much read the daily news and then make it funny. Do you think that's saving our country and our world?
Saving it? Lots of studies have been done on that. Some positive, some negative. Jon Stewart was very successful. He got the ridiculous show Crossfire. They basically crumbled because of Jon Stewart's biting irony and humor. Look into that. I don't have time to go into that here, but he brought that ridiculous show down. Crossfire did not help society. It was mostly two opposing viewpoints attacking each other, not helpful. And he pointed it out in a way that worked. On the other hand, Stephen Colbert and his Colbert Report, where he plays a role, and it seems unmistakable the role that he's playing. He's mocking and mimicking in a mocking way a particular political attitude, attacking that political attitude. But the people whom he was ultimately belittling took him as speaking seriously. And so instead of changing their minds and getting them to recognize the absurdity of a position or whatever it was, they doubled down and said, yeah, look at what this guy says. That's what I believe. Not realizing that he's being satirical and it's a parody. And so I think humor is obviously an outlet. It's good that it's at night. People go to bed laughing. That's been the case for the past 50 years for late night TV. Whether or not it's going to save the world, I'd love to say yeah, but I would need an argument for that, and I don't have one. I think the more you laugh, the better you are. Again, if your laughter persists over 4 hours, you should stop. Go get a doctor. Something.
Thank you.
That's funny.
All right, guys, it is 6 p.m. I think there's one more person. If Keva, you have a question you want to ask this time around, let us know real quick if that's the case.
Yeah.
Okay,
I was
real
wondering.
quick, and then we'll wrap it up.
Certainly. You mentioned rats and primates and humans have the ability to laugh. Is this spread within a certain phylum? Like, I mean, is this like go to a certain group of Animalia? Do we have any, evidence that it is in plants, or, how far has this research gone?
Not to plants. I don't know. I know that trees spread and communicate to nearby trees through the root system. So there's a kind of communication. I don't think trees laugh. I don't think plants laugh. I think much more complex neuronal system and nervous system is required for that. The mechanism of laughter is in part of our old brain pathways. So any creatures that have brain structures to humans are capable of this. So primates, monkeys, rats apparently, which is surprising. Now they're not laughing at humor, they're laughing at like being tickled, just as an infant will laugh as it's being tickled. However, Coco, I think it was, primate that knew language and abstractions, would play practical jokes and would laugh as, I think it was Coco, who would play practical jokes on humans. And it was clearly, I intend to do this, I've made fun of you, I'm laughing at what has just happened. That's not tickling, that's more advanced forms of humor. Where that ends, I don't know. The fact that it extends to rats is surprising. So I'm not entirely sure that research has gone, how far down it has gone.
All right, thank you.
Thank everybody for your questions and your participation. I'm sorry this wasn't more natural and spontaneous. You have IT to blame for that, and whoever's been Zoom bombing classes at SBCC.
Yeah.
Chris, this was an amazing, comprehensive, in-depth talk. I'm really impressed not only by your knowledge in philosophy, but also in neuroscience. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being there.
It must have felt really strange to talk to a screen and with no feedback or anything.
Yeah, it was, especially if it's things that I thought were hilarious. But so. Well, enjoy your.
Pressure on me as your single audience member.
I know that helped though. It helped me immensely. So 6 p.m. It's time for you to have your first cocktail of the evening. It's noon here, so it's time for me to have my fourth.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Chris.
Bye-bye.